So we will finish our discussion of the central nervous system with a brief look at the anatomy and functions of the spinal cord. The average adult spinal cord is approximately 18 inches in length, extending from the foramen magnum at the base of the occipital bone, all the way down to the first or second of the lumbar vertebra in the vertebral column. The spinal cord is not the entire length of the vertebral column because the spinal cord does not grow significantly after the first or second year of life. However, we know that the skeleton, including the vertebral column, does continue to grow. So, very quickly, the vertebral column becomes longer than the spinal cord itself. As a whole, the spinal cord functions to convey sensory information to the brain, as well as motor commands to muscles or glands that are coming down from the brain. Sensory neurons from the periphery make synapses with integration neurons in the spinal cord, which are called interneurons, and we will see those later. And these interneurons are going to carry that information to the brain. Motor neurons have axons that extend out of the spinal cord and make synapses with the various muscles or glands that they will be controlling. The spinal cord contains the same meningeal layers that the brain does. So if you think of the spinal cord as a long, slender extension of the brain, then this configuration of the meninges makes sense. The only difference is that the dura mater of the spinal cord contains a single layer, whereas the dura mater of the brain had two layers. The subarachnoid space between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater contains cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, which helps to cushion the spinal cord. In contrast to the brain and the cranial bones, the spinal cord has a protective layer of adipose tissue between it and the vertebral column. This layer is located in the epidural space. At the very distal end of the spinal cord, where it anatomically ends at the first or second lumbar vertebra, there's a cone-shaped cap or cone-shaped structure that is referred to as the conus medullaris. Because the spinal cord ends before the vertebral column ends, or the spinal cord terminates before the end of the vertebral column, we see a thin connective tissue filament, which is referred to as the filum terminale, that helps to anchor the spinal cord to the coccyx. And also because the vertebral column continues to grow after the spinal cord stops growing, the nerves that emerge from the conus medullaris continue to grow and result in a long bundle of nerves that resemble a horse's tail, and this bundle is referred to as the cauda equina. Along the entire length of the spinal cord are pairs of spinal nerves that emerge from it. These nerves carry sensory information from sensory structures in the periphery, but these nerves also contain motor neurons that are communicating motor commands to muscles and glands. Different neurons within the nerves are carrying these signals. So we have sensory neurons carrying the sensory information to the spinal cord and to the brain. And we have motor neurons carrying the motor commands. The spinal nerves arise from different regions of the spinal cord, and in total there are 8 pairs of spinal nerves that emerge from the cervical region, 12 pairs that emerge from the thoracic region, 5 pairs that emerge from the lumbar region. Since the spinal cord itself ends at the first lumbar vertebra, the spinal nerves that emerge from between each lumbar vertebra are actually from the cauda equina. And finally, we see that there are 5 pairs that emerge from between the foramina that are in the sacrum, and then 1 spinal nerve that emerges from the coccyx. This diagram shows another view of the meninges of the spinal cord, with the vertebral column being removed for clarity. Just like with the brain, the pia mater helps to anchor many blood vessels and many capillaries to the surface of the spinal cord. In general, the spinal cord is about 1 inch wide. In 2 regions of the spinal cord, called the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement, the spinal cord is actually a lot wider than this. And this is due to the fact that there are somatic motor neurons that serve the skeletal muscles of the upper limbs. Those come from the cervical enlargement, and somatic motor neurons that serve the skeletal muscles of the lower limbs that are found in the lumbar enlargement. So to conclude our discussion of the central nervous system, let's review the internal anatomy of the spinal cord. now that we're a lot more familiar with its external anatomy. Internally, we find that the spinal cord has the opposite configuration of the brain. The white matter, which is collectively called the funiculi, is located superficially, while the gray matter, which is collectively called the horns, is located more internal and deep to the spinal cord surface. However, just like the brain, the white matter of the spinal cord contains the axons, which are usually heavily myelinated, of neurons that are running up and down the length of the spinal cord. The gray matter contains the dendrites and the somas, or the cell bodies, of neurons, and the gray matter is also the place where the synapses between neurons that are communicating with one another are located. These regions appear gray in color because the neuron somas and the dendrites do not have myelin because they are not creating action potential, so they have no need for myelin. There's a slender cavity that runs down the length of the spinal cord that's referred to as the central canal. It's situated between two halves of the gray matter. And the central canal is an extension of the fourth ventricle of the brain, and it also contains cerebrospinal fluid. Emerging from each of the lateral sides of the spinal cord are the spinal nerves, and of course these are peripheral nervous system structures. As each spinal nerve approaches the spinal cord, it branches into the spinal nerve roots, and then further splits and divides there into smaller branches that are called the spinal nerve rootlets. The roots and the rootlets on the dorsal or the posterior side of the spinal cord are called the dorsal root and the dorsal rootlets. Meanwhile, the roots and the rootlets on the ventral or anterior side of the spinal cord are called the ventral root and ventral rootlets, respectively. The dorsal root ganglion is a structure that appears as an enlargement in the dorsal root. This structure contains the cell bodies of sensory neurons whose axons are entering the spinal cord and making synapses with the integration neurons that are located in the horns of the gray matter. Looking at the neurons that compose the dorsal and ventral roots, we see that the neurons in the dorsal root are responsible for carrying sensory information to the spinal cord. These sensory neurons make synapses with integration neurons that are called interneurons, and the interneurons are responsible for receiving and responding to that sensory information. Some of the neurons are somatic sensory neurons that are carrying general sensory information from the skin, the skeletal muscles, the joints, as well as other connective tissues. Meanwhile, other populations of neurons are what are called the visceral sensory neurons, which are carrying sensory information from the organs that are located inside the thoracic and the abdominal cavities. The neurons that are within the ventral root are responsible for carrying motor commands out of the spinal cord and communicating with muscles and glands in the periphery. Some of these motor neurons are somatic motor neurons that will stimulate skeletal muscles to contract. Meanwhile, others are visceral or autonomic motor neurons that control involuntary muscles, such as cardiac muscle or smooth muscle. But the visceral motor neurons will also stimulate glands as well. Internally, the gray matter horns are where the sensory processing and motor commands are issued from. The patch of gray matter that's closest to the posterior side of the spinal cord is called the dorsal horn. Meanwhile, the gray matter that's closest to the anterior side is called the ventral horn. The lateral horn of gray matter, which is only found in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord, contains the cell bodies of neurons that communicate with autonomic structures, that is, involuntary muscles or glands in the thoracic and abdominal cavities. So these neurons control autonomic functions of cardiovascular, urinary, as well as digestive system structures, just to name a few. The dorsal horn is responsible for sensory processing. Sensory neurons whose axons enter the spinal cord through the dorsal root make synapses with interneurons in the dorsal horn. And it's these interneurons that are responsible for the processing of that sensory information. So the double S refers to the somatic sensory processing neurons, while VS refers to the visceral sensory processing neurons. The somatic and visceral interneurons have very short axons that will then make synapses with motor neurons in the nearby ventral or lateral horns. The somatic interneurons have synapses with somatic motor neurons in the ventral horn, which will issue commands to skeletal muscles, while the visceral interneurons have synapses with visceral motor neurons that are located primarily in the lateral horn. The white matter columns have an organization that is not quite as tidy as the gray matter horns. The white matter columns, which are collectively called the funiculi, have a similar naming scheme to that of which we saw in the gray matter horns. The dorsal funiculus is located on the dorsal or posterior side of the spinal cord. Ventral funiculus is located on the anterior or the ventral side. And the lateral funiculus is found in the lateral aspect of the spinal cord. The regions that are highlighted in blue represent the ascending tracts, that is, these are bundles of neurons, axons that are ascending and carrying sensory information from the body up through the spinal cord to the sensory interpretation areas in the brain. And the tracts that are highlighted in red are the descending tracts, that is, these are bundles of axons that are carrying motor commands from the brain down to muscles or glands that are located throughout the body.